In the last few weeks at weights, some verses in the Bible that talk about weights. And I don't know if you thought about this one, but we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 5 tonight. Carolyn has kindly agreed to come and share the reading with us. So it's Daniel chapter 5. Yeah.
Daniel, it's a long chapter, I might have to.
I'll have a topic on the board after.
Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. In the same hour the fingers of a man's hand appeared, and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation." Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you, that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom, majesty, glory, and honour. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. The fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been found weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple, and put a chain of gold around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler of the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old.
One of the most awesome chapters in the whole Bible, when we see the finger of God writing upon that wall. I think the weighing scales, the scales that we had with Anna earlier, is a very apt little visual to remind us about the fact that God holds all things. The weights, the balances of God are held in his hand. And it was something that Belshazzar would have done well to remember. Just before we start, it mentions here about Nebuchadnezzar being his father. It's a bit misleading. He means his forefathers. He was probably his grandfather, but he would have known about these events. That's the important point that God is impressing through Daniel. You should have learned from what happened with your granddad. You should have learned from how he was treated. And we have a look to see about some of the lessons that Belshazzar should have learned. And maybe things that he did know, the things that he forgot, or things that he allowed to get out of control. Why do I use that term, get out of control? Well, as we start chapter 5, we see that it is the time of a feast. The feasting would have been around the gods that they worshipped. And Belshazzar is making a great feast. And Belshazzar does some things that even by their own rule he shouldn't have been doing. Just etiquette. Normally the king would eat separate during the feast. But at this time, he is eating with 1,000 of his lords. Now, why he should be doing that, there's a lot of thoughts and theories. But at this time, Babylon is being besieged. Babylon is being besieged by a great army, by the Medes and the Persians, and yet they feel extremely confident in their own safety. It seems a bit odd. If you've got an army around you, why are you so confident? Well, Babylon had some of the greatest fortifications and thickest walls that had ever been built. And they had enough food to last for years. So much so that they wanted to make a statement that even though they were in the siege, they could have this huge banquet, this huge feast. And the armies running about would see that they were still having their feasts. And it was almost as if they were saying to them, you don't know how strong we are. We will stand up against your siege. So he is there, he is calling this great feast. He has 1,000 of his lords there. And then in verse 2 it says, while he tasted the wine. And it doesn't just mean while he was having a little sip. What it means is when the wine had started to impact upon his thinking. When he had started to come under the influence of the drink. He then gave some rather incredible commands. And you wonder where the Spirit, well, you don't wonder, you know, where the Spirit was coming from that was motivating him to do these things. In verse 2 we read that Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem. He sends for the sacred vessels from the very temple of God there in Jerusalem. And if you were present at the feast, you almost feel like shouting, "Stop! Belshazzar, stop! What on earth are you doing? What line are you crossing here?" And in the midst of all the revelry and all the partying that is going on, he decides, very strange thing, let's go and get, it's not enough. They were one of the wealthiest civilizations the earth has ever known. He had enough vessels. It's not that he needs to do this. He is making a statement. He wants to do this. And he calls forth for the very vessels from the temple. And when they go and fetch them and they bring them, we read in verse 3 what they start to do. The gold vessels that have been taken from the temple, from the very house of God. Remember that. The temple is God's dwelling, it's God's house. They were for God's use and for the use of his servants, for the use of his ministers. They were for a designed purpose. And they had been taken from the temple, and that was bad enough. But here they are, they have now been taken from the storerooms of Babylon. And Belshazzar has called them in to this horrible atmosphere of the feast. And those gold vessels that have been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines, started to drink from them. They pulled those sacred items into their vile feasting. Because by this time it wasn't just him and the lords. He had invited his wives and all his concubines, and everybody was drinking and things were getting way out of hand. And the Bible tells us what they started to do with these cups of drink. Verse 4 says, they drank wine and they praised, they toasted the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. They were celebrating their victory over Judah. They were celebrating their victory over God. They were celebrating the dominion of their gods over the God of Judah. And that was the spirit behind what was going on. And Daniel calls that out exactly. That is what they started to do. You see, it is true that God has given us all a free will. But it is also true that God places lines in the sand. And there are certain things that he will not tolerate. Certain things where people just overstep the mark. And although we've been given a free will, God says, you do not pull me into your ridicule and to your silliness. You do not mock me and my authority in the midst of all your reveling. Because that's exactly what they were doing. And so then in verse 5 we read this incredible verse that in that very hour, while all this frivolity is going on, all of a sudden, in the same hour, they see the fingers of a man's hand. That's all they see, are the fingers of the hand. And they start to write in the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. This finger starts to engrave writing upon the very wall of the king's palace. And that is very significant because on the walls of the king's palace would have been a record of all the exploits of the kings, all the exploits that the Babylonians had done, all the peoples that they had conquered, all the gods that they had conquered. It would all be there written on the walls as a visual reminder of their greatness. And over all their achievements, this writing appears. And they see it literally being written, letter by letter. They see the writing form. What impact does that have on the king? Well, he sobers up very, very quickly. Fear grips him. Look at what we read in verse 6. It says, first of all, his countenance changed. His face changed. That laughter, that frivolity, that lightness, It's gone. The countenance has changed. His thoughts start to trouble him. He starts to think, what is this all about? And then, physically, the joints of his hips are loosed. His knees start knocking. He is literally shaking from fear. There is something here that he does not understand. There is something here that he is in total, not in control of. He has no idea what it is about, and he has no control over it at all. And it says in verse 7, he cries aloud, he screams. And who does he scream for? He screams for the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, the people who are supposed to know, the advisors, the people who are supposed to be able to tell him the things that he doesn't know. And he calls them all in. And he tells them, whoever can read the writing, whoever can tell me what these words mean, I will honor him. I will give him purple robes, a sign of royalty, a sign of authority, a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. He is desperate to know, what do these words mean? Why have they been written? What do they mean? And of course, nobody can read them. Nobody can interpret them. None of the so-called wise men of Babylon have any idea what this is all about. Well, he was troubled before. It tells us in verse 9, he is now greatly troubled. Because now, it's not just the fact it's been written and he doesn't know, he understands that nobody knows. And that lack of knowledge, not knowing, is so difficult, isn't it? And as a king, he is used to knowing. And yet, nobody knows. How will he ever find out? And it's troubling him greatly. And his lords are in awe. His lords are astonished as well. They have all witnessed this. It is a public declaration. And none of them can give any answer. None of them have a clue as to what it means. With all the commotion that is going on, the noise comes to the queen. Now, this is not his wife, the queen. It's not his queen. It is the queen mother. It is the one who used to be queen, and yet still has some authority within the household, and obviously still has some respect from Belshazzar. But she hasn't been involved in the feast. It tells us she has come into the banqueting hall. She made a wise decision. Whether she'd been invited or not, I don't know, but she wasn't there. She didn't want to be there. Probably because she knew some of the stuff that would be going on. And she enters the banqueting hall. And she speaks to the king. And she simply says this in verse 11. It's a wonderful thing. There is a man. You see, he is despairing that there is not a man. He is despairing that no one can tell him. But she is very confident. There is a man. And he's sure in your kingdom. He's sure in this city. Why is she so confident in this man? Well, we read it in verse 11. The Spirit of the Holy God is upon him. She knew Daniel's God. She knew him. She remembered him. She knew his God and she knew Daniel. There is a man. There is somebody here. You don't know him. But he is sure. And he bears the very Spirit of God himself. And in the days of your grandfather, in the great days of the kingdom, when Nebuchadnezzar was defeating whoever he wanted, this man was exalted by your grandfather. He was given a position of authority by him. And there's almost a chastisement in these words. Why isn't he here now? Why isn't he part of your court? Why isn't he part of your advisors? Well, your grandfather had him as the lead advisor. He exalted him above all others. But he has become a nobody. You have forgotten him. But she remembered him. She knew about Daniel. She knew that he had an excellent spirit. Nothing greater than the Spirit of God living inside Daniel and moving Daniel. And through God he was able to deliver knowledge, understanding, the interpretation of dreams, the solving of riddles, and the explaining of enigmas, or, as you might have in your margin, the untying of knots. And that's what he needs now. He needs somebody to untie this. He needs somebody to come in and to explain this to him. How well did the queen know Daniel? She must have known him pretty well. She seems to know what he's capable of doing. And at the end of verse 12, she makes a declaration which is very bold. He will give the interpretation. Not that he can, not that he might, he will. She's confident in Daniel's God. The king is absolutely desperate, and it's no surprise that he quickly calls for Daniel. And Daniel is brought before the king. But it's really sad that the king addresses him. Are you that Daniel? You see, the king didn't know him. The king didn't know who he was. Are you that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? What a put down is that? Are you that Daniel, who's a captive from Judah? And by the way, that's the Judah that my father the king has conquered. What a way to refer to him. Verse 14 says, I have heard of you. And that was the problem. He had only heard of him through the queen. He didn't know him for himself. There is so much in the realms of Christianity where our friends and family know of him, but they don't know him. They don't know him for themselves. They have no personal knowledge of Christ. And here the king has no personal knowledge of Daniel at all. I have heard of you. I don't know you, but I've heard of you. And I've heard that the Spirit of God is in you. Again, he's not sure because he doesn't know for himself. In verse 16, he uses the same phrase, I have heard of you, that you can, not that you will. Notice the difference. He doesn't have the certainty because he doesn't know for himself. He doesn't know Daniel, and he doesn't know the God of Daniel. I have heard of you, that you can give interpretations. Now, if you can, again, there's that doubt. The queen had said he will give. Belshazzar is saying, if you can. He doesn't know. He's not sure. And he talks about all the riches that will come Daniel's way, all the authority, all the recognition. And Daniel gives a lovely response in verse 17. He simply says, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. I'm not interested. I'm not interested in what you say you can give to me. Yet I will read the right thing. Again, the certainty. I will read the right thing. And then from verse 18 on, Daniel explains what is behind the writing. He doesn't go straight to the writing itself. He explains to Belshazzar why the writing has appeared in the first place. He refers to him in verse 18 as a king, and rightly so. He is the king. O king. But then he reminds him of the one higher than him. O king, the most high God, gave Nebuchadnezzar your father the kingdom. Remember, he mentioned Nebuchadnezzar to Daniel as a put down. Nebuchadnezzar has defeated you and dragged you here. Daniel says, no, God placed your father in charge of the kingdom. He reminded Nebuchadnezzar of who rules. And we've been reminded of this on numerous occasions over the last few months. God rules. Belshazzar thought he ruled. But Daniel reminded him, you are only allowed to be here by God's will. It is only God who really rules. It is God who is in control. You have bragged about all that your grandfather has done. Well, God allowed him to do it. Because of the majesty that God gave him. Notice in verse 19, he reminds him again where the authority truly lies. It lies with God. But then he goes on to talk about a situation that happened with Nebuchadnezzar. That Nebuchadnezzar lifted his head up in pride. And when Nebuchadnezzar had made similar mistakes, not as severe as Belshazzar's, granted, but similar mistakes, when he got carried away by his greatness and by his pride. It says in verse 20, when his heart, that's Nebuchadnezzar, when his heart was lifted up, his spirit was hardened in pride. He was deposed of the throne. He lost the throne through his pride. And that's exactly what's going to happen now. Belshazzar is going to lose the throne because of his pride. He's making exactly the same mistake. He's believing in his own greatness, and he has forgotten there is a God in heaven. Daniel reminded Belshazzar that Nebuchadnezzar had lost his mind completely. He had become as a wild beast. He had lain with the animals. He had eaten with the animals. The dew of the morning lay upon him with the animals, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of man, and he appoints over it whomever he chooses. God rules. And then we have that little word in verse 22, but. And this is the crunch. But you, his grandson, you, his offspring, you who should know better, you who've had the benefit of example, you who've had the benefit of experience, you who've had the benefit of knowledge, you're not ignorant. You're not ignorant. You know these things. You, his son, have not humbled yourself in your heart, even though you knew all this. The God who knows our hearts, he knew exactly what Belshazzar was aware of. And Belshazzar is not acting in ignorance about a God who has not revealed himself. Belshazzar is repeating the same mistake of pride that his grandfather made. In spite of knowing what happened to his grandfather, in spite of knowing about the God's dealing with the family, he makes the same mistake again. And he takes it further. Not only is he lifted up by his own pride, he challenges God himself. That is what we read in verse 23, when Daniel is explaining to him that God has seen his heart and understands the motives around the actions that he's doing. You have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. Your actions this day have been a proclamation of your pride, of your greatness. And you have set yourself up against the God of heaven. You have lifted yourself up against him. You have brought the vessels from his house. You have brought those things that belong to him. And you, your lords, your wives, your concubines, you've all been drinking of these sacred things. You've been counting them as worthless. You've been counting them as things that you now have control over, that you can now decide what they are for, when God had ordained what they should be used for. It's the challenge to God. God, you have given these vessels to be used in your temple. Well, we'll destroy your temple, we drag their vessels away, and we will use them for our own purposes. It's a direct challenge to the authority of God. And not only have you done all of this, you've compounded it, because you have toasted and praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. You have exalted your gods, and you have made out, you have declared that you are able to do this, because your gods are mightier than the God of heaven. How foolish you've been. These gods that you are worshipping, they do not see or hear or know. But that writing on the wall, what did it show? It showed that God heard. It showed that God saw. It showed that God knew. And that is the big declaration that God is saying to Belshazzar, I am a God who sees and hears and knows. And you're exalting all these other gods above me, and you have lost sight of me. These gods which do not see or hear or know, but the God who holds your breath in his hand. What an incredible phrase that is. You are so proud of your greatness, and your very breath is held in the hand of God. He owns you. What an incredible way to talk. He owns all your ways. He is God. He rules. You're so proud of your greatness and all you can do. You can only ever do what God allows. And this God, you have worshipped and praised all your gods with a small g, but this God with a capital G, you have not glorified. You have not exalted him. And actually, you've done the exact opposite. You debased him. You insulted him. Incredible, isn't it? He asked for what the writing meant. And Daniel comes and says, before I tell you anything, you need to know why the writing has appeared. And he explains everything to him. So he says, this is why the fingers of the hand have been sent from him. The fingers have been sent from God. And they've written on the wall, and this is what has been written. Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. And this is what it means. Daniel told him plainly, mene, God has numbered your kingdom. The word means to number. It's used twice. You see, the numbering had started and the numbering had ended. God had numbered his kingdom and he'd finish it. He'd had enough. It had come to an end. He'd set the mark. Tekel. The first one is talking about his kingdom. Tekel. You have been weighed in the balances. You have been found wanting. Brings it home, doesn't it, to his own heart. It's you. God is dealing with you, Belshazzar. You are the one behind all of this. It was of your idea. It was of your motive. It was of your doing. And God has weighed you in the balances. Just as we had the balances with Hannah here earlier. God has put you in the balances. God weighs all of us in the balances. And we don't even off. We're found wanting. You see, in that weighing, we need substance. We need weight. And God has said, you've been found wanting. I put on one side all the deeds, and I put you on the other side. You are so wanting. You lack substance. You think you're so great, and yet God sees who you really are. And God sees your lack. Where would you and I be but for the cross? Where would you and I be? Where would you and I be when we stand before a holy God? And each and every one of us are placed in his balances that gives a true measure. Each and every one of us without Christ would fail on that way. We would all be found wanting. We lack substance. I thank God that when I stand before him, I don't stand alone. Christ stands by my side. He gives weight to the scales. Whatever is added on the other side cannot outweigh him. Whatever is added, whatever charge is brought against us, Christ is sufficient to meet the gaze of God. We do not stand before the judgment of God alone. We stand through the righteousness of Christ. Christ stands with us. And it is his death, it is his sacrifice that pays the price for our sin, that enables us to be weighed and not to be found wanting, because he is perfect. Belshazzar, you have been weighed in the balances. And if you dare come before God in your own strength, in your own pride, in your own greatness, God gives a true weight. He gives a true measure. And you're found lacking. Perez. Quite funny, Perez, because the word is upharsin. But upharsin is the plural of Perez. And it means to divide. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians were an alliance of two nations, and the kingdom was going to be lost to them. Most awesome account of a man who thought he could stand and rebel against God. But is that really unique in the world in which we live? How many times will this be repeated before the throne of God, when man will seek to stand before him in his own merit, in his own strength, in his own power, in his own pride? And I guarantee you tonight, the result will never change. Any who stand before God alone are found wanting. But I can also promise you this: any who stand with Christ are not found wanting. They find an acceptance. We do not stand in our own righteousness. He stands with us, and he clothes us in his righteousness. Verse 30 tells us that very night Belshazzar lost his kingdom. That very night Belshazzar was slain. That very night Belshazzar was weighed and faced the very God that he had disdained. It's an incredible chapter, but a wonderful reminder. God rules, and Christ stands with us, and we do not stand on our own, and we will never be weighed without Christ. Christ